She knelt in the dark with her hands buried in cool, damp rot, and the whole of Prosperity County agreed she had lost her mind. The whispers had followed her wagon out of town, clinging to her like the dust of the road. A woman alone, with nothing but a mule, a few crates of household goods, and $95 to her name, buying the old Hemlock place. It wasn't even a place anymore. It was a scar, a black-toothed grin of charcoal stumps where a fine apple orchard had once stood, burned to the soil 2 summers prior in a lightning strike. The consensus in the general store around the pot-bellied stove that was the town's heart was that Elara Vance was either a fool or courting ruin with a grim sort of poetry. It was one thing to be poor, another to actively purchase your own grave. But here she was, night after night, long after the last lamp in the valley had been extinguished, kneeling in the lowest basin of that ruined land. She worked by the light of a single hooded lantern, her hands sifting through the crumbling, fragrant decay of fallen trees. She wasn't digging for roots or treasure. She was tending to it, turning the pulpy wood, watering it from a bucket she hauled from the one sluggish creek that still bisected the property. To any soul who might have spied her, a ghostly figure in the immense dark, she would have looked like a penitent worshipping at an altar of ash and failure. They would have shaken their heads and felt a deep, satisfying pity. Pity was easy. It cost nothing and made the giver feel fortunate. What they could not see was the fierce, quiet arithmetic happening behind her eyes, the calculations of moisture and shadow and time. What they could not smell was the strange, earthy perfume of hope rising from the rot. And what they did not yet know was that in a year's time, their pity would turn to envy, and their envy to a desperate, humbling hunger. 18 months earlier, the door to her father's farm had been shut behind her. It wasn't a slam, but a quiet, oiled click that sounded more final than any crash. The man from the bank, Mr. Silas Blackwood, had a face as smooth and emotionless as a river stone. He didn't even look at her. He looked at the ledger in his hand. The numbers had been against them for years. A slow tide of debt rising against a bulwark of bad harvests and falling prices. Her father's death had been the last stone that broke the wall. "The bank is regretful, Miss Vance," he'd said, his voice a dry rustle of paper. She had $95 in a cloth purse, the sum total of her existence, and the clothes on her back. She walked away from the porch swing her father had built, from the lilacs her mother had planted, and did not look back. Looking back was a luxury for people who had somewhere to return to. Prosperity County was not a place for a woman alone with no family and no prospects. She was expected to drift on, to find work as a laundress or a seamstress in a bigger town, to become someone else's problem. But Elara had her father's stubbornness, a quiet, deep-rooted thing that the town mistook for foolishness. She walked not out of the county but to its administrative heart, the land office. The clerk, a man with ink-stained fingers and a perpetually tired expression, listened to her request with a raised eyebrow. "Ma'am, for that kind of money, you're looking at parcels nobody wants. Drainage ditches, rock falls." He unrolled a vast, crackling map of the county, a patchwork of neatly ruled squares and sprawling, unclaimed territories. Her eyes scanned past the prime river-bottom land, the fat squares of prairie owned by cattlemen and grain syndicates. She was looking for something else. Her finger, slender and smudged with road dust, traced the edges, the forgotten corners. And then it stopped. On a jagged plot marked in faint red ink, Hemlock Orchard, St. Defunct. The clerk chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "That's the burn-over. Nothing there but charcoal and ghosts. Lightning fire took the whole thing. The soil's soured with ash. You'd do better to sleep in the street." She looked at the price penciled in the margin, $70. "I'll take it," she said, her voice so quiet he had to lean forward. He tried to argue, a flicker of genuine concern in his tired eyes. A young woman alone could not run a place like that. It was throwing good money, what little she had, into a hole. But her stillness was an argument he couldn't counter. He sighed, stamped the deed with a heavy thud, and counted her money. She walked out of the office with a piece of paper that said she owned 20 acres of ruin and $25 left to build a life upon it. Her arrival at the burned orchard was a silent affair. She'd spent 5 of her remaining dollars on a sway-backed mule and another 3 on a cart, into which she'd loaded the few possessions she'd been allowed to take: a cast-iron skillet, a wool blanket, a box of her mother's books, a small axe. As she guided the mule down the main road, then turned onto the rutted track leading to the Hemlock place, the life of the county seemed to pause. A farmer on a hay wagon stopped his team to stare. 2 women gossiping over a fence fell silent, their eyes following her with a mixture of morbid curiosity and outright scorn. The judgment was a physical thing, a pressure in the air. This was not just a poor decision, it was a public spectacle. The land itself was worse than she had remembered. It was a graveyard of trees. Blackened limbs reached for the sky like skeletal fingers, and a fine, greasy ash coated everything, turning the world to shades of gray. The air smelled of old smoke and deep-seated loss. There was no house, only the collapsed, charred foundation where it had once stood. For a moment, standing there with the mule's lead in her hand, the sheer, overwhelming desolation of it threatened to crush her. This was not a farm. This was the scene of a death. She walked the property line, her boots crunching on brittle charcoal. It was on the far side of the plot, tucked into a hill and half hidden by a thicket of sumac that had somehow survived the blaze, that she found it. A small, sturdy structure of fieldstone with a heavy oak door. The old orchard's smokehouse, or perhaps a root cellar. The stone was cool to the touch, and inside it smelled of earth and cold stone, not of fire. The roof was sound. It would have to be enough. That first night she laid her blanket on the packed earth floor. The silence of the place a living presence. It was a silence born not of peace, but of absence. No crickets, no rustle of leaves, no life. Just the whisper of the wind through the dead branches. She lay in the dark, doing the arithmetic of survival. $25, 1 mule, 1 axe, 20 acres of ash. It was a sum that added up to 0. But as fear began to curl in her stomach, another sound reached her, a gentle, rhythmic tapping. She rose and peered out the door. In the twilight, a figure was approaching from the neighboring property, a small, tidy farmstead that had been spared the fire. It was an old man, walking with a slight limp, tapping a walking stick. He stopped a respectful distance from her door. He was small and weathered, with kind eyes set in a deeply lined face. "Good evening," he said, his voice accented, the words shaped with the careful precision of a language learned late in life. "I'm Casimir." He held out a bundle wrapped in cloth. "My wife. She thinks no one should face a new home with an empty stomach." Inside was a loaf of dark bread and a wedge of hard cheese. She hadn't realized how hungry she was. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick. He didn't ask what she was doing there, or why she'd bought such a hopeless place. He simply looked out at the blackened trees, his gaze thoughtful. Then he turned back to her, a small, slow smile touching his lips. "The fire," he said, his voice gentle. "It doesn't take everything, little bird. It only makes room for what comes next." The work began at dawn the next day. It was not the work of planting, but of archaeology. She had to understand the ruin before she could hope to build on it. With her axe and a small handsaw she'd bought in town for 50 cents, she started clearing the fallen trees. The labor was brutal, unforgiving. The charcoal dust worked its way into her skin, her hair, the lines of her face, until she felt as gray as the landscape around her. Her hands, accustomed to mending and kitchen work, blistered, then bled, then hardened into calluses as tough as bark. Day after day, she felled the dead, skeletal trunks, cutting them into manageable lengths and stacking them in neat, somber piles. The town, what little of it passed on the distant road, saw only a madwoman building pyres in a graveyard. They didn't see the pattern she was creating, the order she was imposing on the chaos. Mr. Casimir would sometimes watch her from his fence line, never offering unsolicited advice, but always ready with a cup of cool water or another offering of bread. One afternoon he hobbled over carrying not food, but a short, thick log. It was damp and heavy and dotted with dozens of tiny, pearl-white pins, no bigger than the head of a nail. My grandfather in the old country, he knew the ways of the forest, he said, holding the log out for her to inspect. After a fire, when the ground is sweet with ash and the heartwood of the fallen trees begins to soften, this is what comes. He pointed to the tiny white dots. They call them many things: ghost buttons, moon drops. We call them ash pearls. They love the rot. They love the dark and the damp that the charcoal holds. He explained that the fire, in its fury, had created the perfect conditions. The intense heat had sterilized the soil, killing off competing fungi, and the ash had changed the pH of the ground. The fallen hardwoods, particularly the maples and oaks that had been mixed in with the apples, were now slowly decaying, their fibers turning into a perfect food source. He showed her how to identify the logs that were in the right stage of decay, not too dry, not too wet, with a pulpy, giving texture under the bark. He brought her a bucket of what looked like muddy water, but which he called a slurry, rich with the invisible spores. You do not plant them like seeds, he instructed, his gnarled finger tracing a line on a log. You invite them. You make a home for them, and if they like it, they will come. That evening, Elara did not stop when the sun went down. She took her lantern and the bucket of slurry down to the lowest part of the property, a natural basin shaded by the hill where the creek ran slowest. The air there was cooler, the ground damper. Hidden from the road, from any curious eyes, she began her true work. She scored the logs she had stacked, creating shallow grooves in the bark. Then, with her bare hands, she scooped up the spore-rich mud and worked it into the wood, into every crack and crevice. It was an act of faith, performed in secret. She was banking a coal, hiding a spark of possibility deep under the ashes of the world's opinion. A few days later, Mr. Blackwood's carriage rattled past on the main road. He slowed his horse, peering toward her property. She saw the smug proprietary set of his shoulders. He was the man who now owned her past, the fields her father had plowed. He glanced at the smoke rising from her stone house, at the lone figure moving through the blackened trees, and a small, dismissive smile touched his lips before he flicked the reins and drove on. Summer arrived like the open door of a furnace, baking the county in a relentless, shimmering heat. The dust on the road was as fine as flour, and the sky remained a hard, cloudless blue for weeks on end. Elara's work became a battle against thirst, both her own and the land's. The creek, her only source of water, shrank from a lively stream to a sluggish, shallow ribbon. Every drop was precious. She spent her mornings hauling bucket after bucket up the slope to her hidden basin, watering the logs as if they were a field of prize-winning roses. The labor was mindless and back-breaking, But it was a ritual that kept despair at bay. It was during one of these grueling, water-hauling treks that she first saw the boy. He was small for his age, perhaps 10, with a shock of unruly blonde hair and clothes that were clean but patched. He sat on a large rock across the creek just watching her. He didn't shout or wave. He just watched, his expression unreadable. She'd seen him in town, a quiet shadow at the edge of other, louder groups of children, always seeming to be on the outside looking in. She ignored him, and he remained. Day after day he was there, a silent witness to her solitary toil. One afternoon, as she paused to wipe the sweat from her brow, she saw him cross the nearly dry creek bed, his bare feet making no sound on the stones. He stopped a few feet away from her, his gaze fixed on the empty bucket in her hand. He still said nothing. He simply reached out, took the bucket from her, and walked down to the creek. He filled it, his small frame straining with the weight, and hauled it back up the slope, setting it down near her feet. Then he turned and went back for the other one. Elara watched, a knot of old guarded suspicion slowly unclenching in her chest. She had grown so used to being an object of scorn or pity that this simple, unasked-for act of help was disarming. When he had brought the second bucket, she gestured to the shade of a surviving sumac. "Sit a moment," she said. She unwrapped the small parcel of her lunch, a piece of hardtack and a sliver of cheese. She broke it in two and held half out to him. He took it without a word, his eyes wide. "I'm Elara," she said. "Finn," he mumbled around a mouthful of food. From that day on, he was her shadow. He would appear after his morning chores in town were done and work alongside her. He stacked wood, cleared brush, hauled water. He was a quiet, diligent partner, and his presence was a balm against the crushing loneliness of the place. He never asked what she was doing or why. He seemed to accept the strangeness of her work as perfectly normal. One cool evening, she decided to trust him. She lit the lantern and led him down into the hidden basin. In the golden light, the long, scored rows of logs looked like sleeping beasts. She knelt and showed him where the wood was beginning to soften and whiten with mycelium, the thread-like roots of the fungus. "This is the real crop," she whispered, as if the trees themselves were listening. Finn stared, his face full of a solemn awe that was worth more to her than a chest of gold. He reached out a tentative finger and touched the velvety white growth. He was not a mocker. He was a believer, and in that moment, in that secret basin of rot, Elara was no longer entirely alone. The first sign of victory came not with a trumpet blast, but with the gentle patter of a cool autumn rain. It rained for 2 days, a soft, soaking drizzle that seemed to sink deep into the soul of the land. On the third morning, Elara woke with a feeling of nervous anticipation. She took her lantern, though the sun was barely up, and with Finn trailing silently behind her, she went down to the basin. She held the light high, her breath catching in her throat, and there they were. Pushing up from the dark, damp logs were hundreds, thousands of perfect pearlescent mushrooms. They were not white, but a luminous, silvery gray, like drops of moonlight solidified. They grew in thick, beautiful clusters, their surfaces smooth and cool to the touch. Ash pearls. Mr. Casimir had been right. It had worked. A slow, deep joy, more potent than any she had ever known, spread through her. She sank to her knees, heedless of the damp earth, and just looked. All the back-breaking labor, all the mockery, all the lonely nights of arithmetic, it had all led to this silent, stunning abundance. "There's so many," Finn whispered, his voice full of wonder. The harvest was a careful, reverent affair. With small, sharp knives, they twisted each cluster from the wood, taking care not to disturb the mycelium beneath. Basket after basket was filled. The sheer volume was staggering. It was more than a meal, more than a winter's supply. This was a commodity. The arithmetic in her head began to spin again. But this time, the numbers were different. They were numbers of profit, of possibility. She knew she couldn't sell them in prosperity. They were too strange, and the town's palate was conditioned by potatoes and corn. Besides, she wasn't ready to reveal her secret. The world was not yet ready to see it. She used 10 of her remaining $15 to hire a man with a wagon, a taciturn farmer from the far end of the county who asked no questions. She loaded 4 heavy, cloth-covered baskets into his cart and made the day-long journey to the city. She had heard of the grand hotels there, with their fancy restaurants and chefs who paid high prices for rare ingredients. She walked into the back entrance of the finest one, the Argent, and asked for the head chef. A towering man with a pristine white apron and a skeptical scowl emerged from the steam-filled kitchen. "What is it?" he snapped, his eyes dismissing her as another farm hopeful with a bushel of wilted greens. Without a word, she pulled the cloth from a basket. The chef fell silent. He leaned closer, his expression shifting from annoyance to intense curiosity. He picked up one of the ash pearls, holding it to the light. He broke a piece off, smelled it, then placed a tiny fragment on his tongue. His eyes closed. When they opened again, all the skepticism was gone, replaced by the keen, avaricious gleam of a connoisseur who has found something new and priceless. "Mon Dieu," he breathed. "Where did you get these?" "They grow on my land," Elara said, her voice steady. "How much do you have?" "More than this." "I'll take it all," he said. "Name your price." She looked him in the eye, her heart pounding. She named a price that was both fair and firm, a number she had rehearsed in her head the entire journey. It was more money than her father had made in his last 2 years of farming. The chef didn't even haggle. He counted out the cash into her hand, his eyes never leaving the baskets. She returned to the burned orchard that night with a heavy purse and a light heart. The secret was still safe, banked like a warm coal under the ash. Winter settled over the county, a hard, brittle cold that locked the ground and silenced the world. For most, it was a time of rest, of waiting. For Elara and Finn, it was a time of furious, hopeful industry. Fueled by the money from the city, they expanded their operation. Elara bought better tools, sharp saws, a sturdy wheelbarrow, thick leather gloves. She invested in knowledge, purchasing a book on fungi from a city bookseller. She and Finn spent the cold evenings by the light of her small stove, poring over the drawings and descriptions, learning the science behind Mr. Casimir's old-world wisdom. Their days were spent preparing for the spring. They felled more of the dead trees, selecting only the best hardwoods. They dug the basin deeper, creating tiered shelves for the logs to maximize the space and control the moisture. The work was still hard, but it was no longer desperate. It was the work of builders, not survivors. With a portion of her earnings, Elara made a peculiar purchase from a traveling tinker. She bought a pair of Emden geese. They were enormous, magnificent birds with snowy white feathers and startlingly blue eyes. They were also preternaturally calm, moving with a slow, deliberate dignity that was almost comical. Finn, delighted, immediately named them General and Tilly. They became the farm's sentinels, their occasional deep, resonant honks a far more effective deterrent to trespassers than any fence. Their presence, absurd and grand, brought a flicker of life and humor to the stark landscape. The town began to notice the changes. They saw the new tools, the plume of smoke that always rose from her stone house. The way she walked with a straight back when she came to the general store for salt and flour. The whispers in the store shifted their tone. Pity curdled into a suspicious curiosity. Where was the money coming from? A woman alone on a burned-out plot shouldn't be thriving. It was unnatural. The rumors eventually reached Mr. Silas Blackwood. His own farm, the one he had taken from her family, was a model of modern efficiency, but it was also expensive to run. The idea that this woman, on land he himself had deemed worthless, was somehow prospering, was an irritant, a burr under the saddle of his pride. One afternoon, his polished carriage appeared at the end of her track. He strolled onto her property with an air of false, paternal warmth. "Miss Vance," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I was just passing and thought I'd see how you were faring. It's a hard life out here for a young woman alone." He let his gaze sweep over the neat stacks of logs, the solid little stone house. He was fishing. "I trust you found it as unproductive as we all assumed." "I'm managing, thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice polite and impenetrable. She stood still, her hands resting on a chopping block, not inviting him closer. His smile tightened. "Perhaps you've reconsidered my thought from last year. The county fund might be persuaded to take this parcel off your hands. For a small profit to you, of course. A gesture of goodwill." He saw her as weak, as someone who could be flattered and manipulated. He was trying to buy her secret for pennies. She simply met his condescending gaze with her quiet stillness. "The land is not for sale." His mask of false concern slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of cold frustration. He tipped his hat, the gesture curt and sharp. "As you wish." As he walked away, the general, who had been silently observing the exchange, let out a long, sonorous honk, as if issuing a formal proclamation of dismissal. Blackwood flinched and hurried back to his carriage, his curiosity now sharpened into a dangerous, pointed suspicion. The second spring arrived with a lie. It came with warm breezes and a sun that felt good on the skin, but it brought no rain. The sky, day after day, was a vast, empty bowl of blue. The creek, which should have been running high with meltwater, remained a pale, shallow version of its former self. Mr. Casimir, who read the weather in the behavior of birds and the feel of the air, would squint at the horizon, his face etched with worry. "This is a thirsty sky, little bird," he'd say, shaking his head. "A very thirsty sky." By May, the lie was exposed. The drought had taken hold. The rich, dark soil of the surrounding farms began to turn pale and crack. The young corn, which had sprouted with such promise, started to yellow at the tips. The bean vines grew listless, their leaves curling inward, as if in prayer for a water that never came. A quiet panic began to settle over Prosperity County. A farmer's wealth was not in his bank account. It was in the living green of his fields, and those fields were dying. But in Elara's shaded basin, a different story was unfolding. The deep bed of charcoal and rotting wood she and Finn had created acted like a sponge, holding on to the memory of the autumn rains. The shade from the hill protected it from the worst of the sun's glare. While the rest of the county withered, her strange secret garden flourished. The ash pearls, loving the consistent dampness and the heat, erupted from the logs in a profusion that dwarfed the previous year's harvest. The fortune inversion had begun. The very things that had made her land worthless to everyone else, the ash, the rot, the deep shade of the basin, were now its salvation. Her burned-over orchard, a symbol of failure, was proving more resilient than the most fertile bottomland in the county. The perception of the townspeople began its final, dramatic reversal. Their wells started to run low. Water became a currency. rationed and guarded. The scorn they'd had for Elara vanished, replaced by a fearful, envious silence. They saw the wagon from the city making regular trips to her gate, leaving with heavy, covered baskets and returning empty. They saw her and the boy, Finn, working with a calm, steady purpose that stood in stark contrast to the growing desperation in their own homes. They saw her mule, fat and healthy. They heard her geese, loud and alive. She was no longer a fool. She was an anomaly, a mystery. And as their own fortunes dwindled, that mystery began to look like a threat, or worse, a miracle they had been blind to. By August, the county was a landscape of failure. The heat had been relentless, the sky a merciless sheet of brass. The cornfields were not fields of gold, but graveyards of brittle, brown stalks. The harvest was a total loss. For the first time in a generation, there was the real, gnawing prospect of hunger in Prosperity County. Pride, a staple crop in the region, was a poor substitute for bread. Mr. Blackwood's carefully managed farm was a disaster. His modern methods were useless against a hostile sky. His grain contracts with the city were void, his investments turning to dust. He was a man watching his empire crumble, and his desperation made him reckless. He had been watching Elara's property, his suspicion hardening into certainty. He must have seen Finn carrying a basket, or caught a glimpse of the pale treasures through the trees. He finally understood. The worthless land wasn't worthless at all. It was producing the one thing that was thriving in the drought. One afternoon, his carriage appeared again, this time without pretense. He didn't stop at the road, but drove his horse right up to her stone house, two grim-faced men he'd hired in town flanking him. He dismounted, his face a mask of cold fury. "Vance," he said, dropping the courtesy of her name. "I know what you're growing in that hollow. Show it to me." Elara came to the door, wiping her hands on an apron. Finn, who had been feeding the geese, moved to stand slightly behind her, his small face set. The General and Tilly stretched their long necks, hissing softly. "This is private property, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice even. "It stops being private when a person is hoarding a resource in a time of crisis," he shot back, his voice ringing with false civic duty. "The town is starving, and you're sitting on a fortune. I'll give you 10 cents a pound for your entire harvest. I will see it's distributed fairly." It was an insulting offer, a fraction of what the city chef was paying. He wasn't trying to buy it. He was trying to steal it under the guise of a lowball offer. "The price is the price, Mr. Blackwood," she said calmly, "and I sell to whom I choose." His face darkened. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low threat. "This is a dry year, Miss Vance, a very dry year. All these dead trees. It would be a shame if another fire were to start. Accidents happen." She didn't flinch. She simply held his gaze. Behind him, the General took 2 stately steps forward, lowered his head, and let out a deafening honk that echoed off the hills. Blackwood jumped, startled. One of his men snickered. Humiliated and furious, Blackwood spun on his heel. "This isn't over," he snarled, climbing back into his carriage and rattling away in a cloud of angry dust. Elara watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew he was right. It wasn't over. The moral calculus of the drought was brutal. Need was a weight on one side of the scale, and opportunity was a weight on the other. Elara had the only abundant crop in 100 miles. She could have charged the city price, now inflated to astronomical heights by the widespread shortages, and become wealthy beyond her wildest imaginings. She could have exploited the town's desperation, the same desperation that had once fueled their mockery of her. The choice came to her gate in the form of Mrs. Gable, a woman whose husband had been one of the loudest scoffers, a man who had declared that Elara was planting ghosts and harvesting disappointment. Mrs. Gable stood there, her face thin with worry, her pride a visible, painful struggle. She did not ask for a handout. "Miss Vance," she said, her eyes fixed on the ground, "I hear you have produce to sell. I've brought what I can." She held up a small, worn purse. In that moment, Elara saw not the wife of a mocker, but a mother whose children were hungry. She saw the reflection of her own past desperation. She looked at the woman's frayed dress, at the hope and shame warring in her eyes, and made her choice. "I have a town price," Elara said gently. She named a figure that was barely above what it cost her in labor and time, a price a poor woman could indeed pay. Mrs. Gable looked up, stunned, her eyes filling with tears of disbelief and gratitude. "God bless you, child," she whispered. Word of her generosity spread through the county faster than the fire ever had. The next day, a trickle of townspeople came to her gate. They came not with scorn, but with empty baskets and humbled hearts. A farmer who had lost his entire corn crop. A blacksmith with no horses to shoe. They came with what little money or trade they had, and Elara treated each one the same. She gave them a fair weight and a fair price. Finn worked beside her, his face serious with the responsibility, carefully weighing the mushrooms on a small scale she had bought. He was no longer just a boy. He was a vital part of an enterprise that was saving his town. The climax arrived on a blistering afternoon. Blackwood returned, but this time he brought the county sheriff with him. "Sheriff," Blackwood declared, his voice booming for all the gathered townspeople to hear, "I am lodging a formal complaint. This woman is hoarding food during a famine and engaging in predatory price gouging against these good people." Several of the townspeople, Mrs. Gable among them, turned to face him. "That's a lie." Mrs. Gable's voice rang out, clear and strong. "She's not hoarding, she's feeding us. She's selling at a price that's kept my children from going hungry." Another farmer stepped forward. "It's true, Sheriff. She could be getting rich in the city, but she's selling to us. Her price is more than fair. It's a kindness." One by one, the people in line, her former mockers, spoke up, their voices weaving a chorus of defense. The sheriff, a practical man, looked from Blackwood's furious, well-fed face to the thin, earnest faces of the townspeople, and then to Elara's calm demeanor. He could see the truth plainly. Blackwood, seeing his plan unravel, lost his composure. In his rage, he made a fatal error. "It's a trick. She has hundreds of pounds of them hidden down in that basin. I demand you seize it for the public good." A silence fell. The sheriff turned his head slowly to look at Blackwood. "A basin? Hundreds of pounds?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, how would you know the exact location and estimated yield of Miss Vance's crop, unless you were trespassing on her land with intent to steal?" Blackwood's face went pale. He had exposed his own greed, his own crime, in front of the entire community he claimed to be protecting. He stammered, unable to form a coherent reply. The sheriff's gaze was like ice. "I think you'd best be on your way, Mr. Blackwood, before I decide to ask you a few more questions about trespassing, and perhaps attempted extortion." Shamed and outwitted, Blackwood scrambled back to his carriage and fled, the quiet, collective stare of the townspeople following him like a verdict. The drought broke in September with a week of gentle, steady rain. The land drank it in, and a faint blush of green returned to the pastures. The immediate crisis was over, but the memory of it had permanently altered the landscape of Prosperity County, both on the ground and in the hearts of its people. Elara Vance was no longer the fool on the hill. She was the woman who had coaxed life from ashes, the one who had chosen generosity when she could have demanded a fortune. They had called her mad for tending to rot. Now they spoke her name with a deep, abiding respect. Some even took to calling her the Ash Queen, and for the first time, the nickname held no mockery, only awe. She didn't hoard her knowledge. With the profits from that second bountiful year, she didn't just rebuild, she taught. She showed a handful of other struggling families how to find the right logs on their own woodlots, how to prepare the slurry, how to tend the secret crop. She helped them establish their own small, hidden gardens of ash pearls. She organized a cooperative, ensuring that the city price they commanded benefited several families, not just one, and that a portion of every harvest was set aside for a town larder, a bulwark against future lean years. She was not just a farmer. She had become a leader. Her authority earned not by words, but by quiet competence and a steady hand. Finn stayed with her, his apprenticeship evolving into a true partnership. He had found his purpose not in the loud, judgmental center of town, but in the quiet, productive basin of the burned-out orchard. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after the drought had broken, Elara stood on the rise overlooking her land with Mr. Casimir. The orchard was transformed. It was no longer a black scar. Young saplings she had planted were taking root between the old, decaying logs. Patches of clover and wildflowers brought color to the ashen soil. The basin, the heart of the enterprise, was a thriving, bustling concern, with new tiers being built on the far side. The two great white geese, General and Tilly, wandered placidly among the trees, their occasional honks the farm's benign anthem. Below, Finn was patiently showing a group of town children how to spot the first tiny pins of a new mushroom bloom on a log. He was passing on the knowledge, completing the circle. Mr. Casimir leaned on his walking stick, a soft, satisfied smile on his face. He gestured with his chin toward the scene below, toward the life that had sprung from death. "You see, little bird," he said, his voice full of a gentle, final wisdom. He was not asking a question. He was stating the fulfillment of a promise. The fire. It did not take everything. Elara looked out over the land she had bought with the last of her hope. Her hands were still rough, stained with the good dirt and honest work of her life. But they were no longer empty. She had built a home, a future, and a community, not upon the memory of what was lost, but on the quiet, stubborn, and abundant promise of what could be coaxed from the ruins.